Excellent. All right, so before I begin lecture, and again, once more, it's over evaluative research. So this is kind of like the last step in the campaign process where we conduct more research to prove whether or not our campaign efforts were successful. You guys, for this class, obviously you won't have to do that, not only because of what we're going through, but just in general, I wouldn't have students conduct evaluative research. What you will have to do instead is kind of outline, if you were to conduct evaluative research, what type of metrics and measurements would you use to determine, again, the successfulness of your campaign. So we'll talk about those measurements and those tools that people in real life or in actual PR agencies use to evaluate the campaign. Before I get into that, I do want to, and also we'll have an exam review if you guys have any questions. I will say if you can, well, I guess it's okay to pose those questions in the chat here on Zoom, but if you have lingering questions about the upcoming exam on Monday, like over the weekend or later on today, I just ask, instead of you emailing it to me, if you can put it in the discussion post here. There is a separate one that states exam 2 questions. And all you have to do is just, in response to this particular guide, this particular prompt, just post your question here. I think it might have been Sarah in her response, her discussion post response to one of them. She had said that in some of her online classes, they have it set up to where questions that students might have are posed in the discussions post. And it's really advantageous for you guys because you can see all the questions that are being asked and my response to it. And it kind of streamlines that process as well. So thank you so much for that feedback, Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and go to the chat here because I felt like I saw something in the chat, and it could be wrong. Nope, never mind. So let me check one more time because I could have sworn I saw something. No. All right. Okay, so yes, that'll take place after lecture today. So let's go ahead and get started with that. All right, so once more, evaluative research is basically something that takes place at the very end of our campaign. So after we've talked about our strategies, we've conducted market research, and then we implement our tactics, we need to prove to the client that essentially our campaign is working and whether or not we need to improve on that campaign. So in today's lecture, I'm going to talk about what exactly do we evaluate when I talk about evaluative research. When exactly do we do it during the campaign process? I think I might have been a little misleading just now when I said this is the very last step in the campaign process. It is the very last step in the campaign proposal process, I'll say, but evaluation takes place throughout the campaign. So as soon as you implement your tactics, you're kind of monitoring and tracking whether or not they are in fact working to achieve your campaign goal. And then more importantly, how exactly do we evaluate our campaign? Again, what type of measurements and tools can we use to get that data that we would then show to the client at the very end of our campaign? So here on this line, I'm just basically explaining the importance of conducting evaluative research. I cannot stress enough how much clients will want some type of proof that what we're doing is valuable, what we're doing is in fact helping them out. And I think this is really indicative of the PR industry in general. And what I mean by that is oftentimes business owners or businesses in general, they don't think about public relations until a crisis comes up, right? And so we constantly in this industry have to prove our value from more of a proactive standpoint. The fact that PR needs to be a fundamental business function and not a reactive, communication response. And so since we kind of have that challenge, in general as an industry, I think that trickles down to what we're providing in terms of services for clients. So that's why evaluative research is so important. We need to prove that what we're doing, the money that the client is investing in our brand or in our agency, I should say, in our services, that it's worthwhile, that it's worth investing in. And not only, in terms of that, but we want to actually prove that, we're improving upon those campaign efforts, as I put there in that last point, and that we can adjust if we have to. All right, so let me go ahead and go through my first point on the agenda in terms of what exactly are we evaluating when I talk about evaluative research. So that is essentially our objective statements. If you guys go back to, I think it was the last thing that we talked about, in reference to exam 1, that was campaign goals and objective statements. So again, in this class, it's not a situation where you can kind of just forget information, you don't apply it. As soon as you take an exam, you forget about it. It's applicable throughout the entire course. And so we're revisiting our objective statements. So yes, this is essentially what we're evaluating in our campaign. And that's why, when I was talking about objective statements, you need to make sure that they are in fact measurable, because if they're not, it's really hard to evaluate whether or not we accomplish those objective statements. So again, with awareness objective statements, we're looking at whether or not people are paying attention to our message, whether or not there's been extensive coverage about our clients. Can people actually understand our message as well? I think I already said that. But can they recognize that message as well? Acceptance, once more, as a reminder, that's your attitude objective statements, excuse me. So whether or not this campaign effort had an impact on the audience's attitudes, whether or not it had an impact on the audience's opinions, things of that nature. And then finally, action. So this is essentially when we try to figure out whether or not our campaign efforts had an impact on the audience's behaviors. And that includes consumer behaviors like purchasing, for instance, or whether or not they attended our grand opening, again, for an example. And then my last point here, in terms of considering some unintended effects of a campaign, that can be difficult, but we want to make sure that we work that in some way. And what I mean by that is we see this a lot in advertising. So for example, here, in Columbus, Ohio, L Brands has been in the news a lot. And they've come under a lot of heat for their lack of body inclusivity, right? There's a lot of research that shows that when young women in particular look at images that you might see in a Victoria's Secret ad, it makes them feel, less secure about their body image, it makes them feel less confident. I'm sure the folks at Victoria's Secret who are designing this ad, they're not thinking to themselves, oh, how can we make young women feel really bad about their body? But nevertheless, that is an effect of consuming that advertisement, depending upon the demographic that you're in. So how can communicators really account for those unintended effects? It can be difficult, but we still need to kind of operationalize that in some way in our campaign. And I think one way of doing that is making sure that you're conducting market research over a variety of audiences, a diverse group of folks, and not just, the typical people that might look at this ad, conducting, a lot of focus groups and surveys, just to make sure that even though we might not have intended this effect to take place, that we're trying to mitigate and avoid that effect. So, yep, that's what we're evaluating in our evaluative research. I'm gonna pause here. Any questions over that? I'm gonna go to the chat. All right, so the second point in terms of evaluative research, when do we evaluate our campaign? Once more, like I said, I felt like I was being a little misleading at the beginning of class. So we evaluate our campaign throughout the campaign. And what I mean by that is, as soon as we implement those tactics and as soon as we put them into action and it's no longer in this proposal phase, that's when we start to evaluate, our entire campaign. And so again, beginning, middle, and end. So in terms of at the beginning, what we're going to do is, collect what we call benchmark data. That benchmark data is usually found in our market research. So for example, a lot of you guys have written your objective statements for your campaign. And let's say that, for example, there are 200 people in the Columbus area who know about global gifts. And we want to increase that by, 50%. We want to double it, right? And so what we can do is conduct a post-campaign survey and compare that data to the pre-campaign data. Again, that is in the form of market research. So whether or not we did in fact double that amount. We can use case studies depending upon the situation that you're in. But yes, market research is really going to be helpful in terms of, providing that preliminary or that pre-campaign data that you need for benchmarking purposes. And then also we might want to conduct or create what we call an implementation report. That's super easy. You will need to know that for the exam along with benchmark data. The implementation report is basically like a brief, synopsis in terms of how well the tactics were executed, what type of platforms did we use, what was the initial response, in the 24 hours, the first 24 hours or 48 hours. And a reason why we do that, again, is for benchmarking purposes, but to kind of assure the client that we implemented those tactics correctly. So that's the implementation report. Now, if we wanted to evaluate our campaign in the middle of the time that it's taking, we would do basically like progress reports, you know, like the ones that you probably got in elementary and middle school. So the same applies here. So whether or not we're still, you know, on track with our campaign objectives and whether or not we're actually accomplishing our campaign goals. So one way that we can do that is through the form of, again, surveys. So we can conduct more surveys over that key public to see if, for example, there is more awareness of global gifts, whether or not people are aware more specifically about their values, their mission statement, things of that sort. If we want to figure out how far our reach is, for instance, like our communication reach or social media reach, we might want to look at impressions. In just a second, I will, or at least later on, I'll define what exactly are impressions and how they're not necessarily engagement, because the two, or sometimes people will confuse the two, but we can use impressions to indicate to what degree are people exposed to our communication message. So that's some of the things that we could do in the middle of our campaign. And then finally, at the end, once more, very similar to an implementation report, we would write up a brief synopsis called a final report to determine whether or not we actually achieved our objective statements. Again, we can continue to conduct, you know, more surveys, more impressions or looking at impressions. We can track our website traffic, for instance, because again, as you guys remember from last class, we want to make sure whatever communication tactics that we're putting out there, that it redirects traffic to our own media, whether that's our website or social media accounts, or redirects like physical traffic to our store, to our, you know, location, our physical location. So that's when we evaluate our campaign. Any questions over that? I'll pause here again. All right, and then finally, how do we evaluate our campaign? I'm going to go a little slower here because this is when I'm going to talk about the specific measurements and metrics, the tools that we use to evaluate our objective statements, right? So again, we're using our objective statements to evaluate the overall campaign. That's why we want to make sure our objective statements are measurable so that we can use those metrics to figure out whether or not they've in fact changed throughout that campaign process. So first, starting with awareness objective statements, we want to ask ourselves the following questions. How many folks actually saw our message? And again, we can assume this through impressions, even though there are some limitations to that. Did people actually understand our message? Was it confusing? Was it clear enough? Did they overall get the point of our advertisement, for instance, or of our press release, of that interview that we landed with 10 TV? And finally, do they recall that message? So it's not enough just to expose people to it. A more enduring impression or a more enduring effect is whether or not people can remember that particular message. I think that's more interesting as opposed to how many people saw that message. So how exactly can we, you know, get the answers to these questions that I just posed here? So there are a few ways that we can do that. From a media coverage standpoint, we could use what's called a clipping service. And you'll also need to know that for the exam. A clipping service is just basically an organization or a business that tracks the media coverage about your client. And you can do this in a variety of ways in terms of you can just have, or the clipping service can just look at newspaper coverage. They can look at just social media. They can look at, you know, TV news, for instance. They can look at local versus national or even international if your client is getting that type of international coverage. So yes, a clipping service, again, is just a media organization that tracks any type of news coverage about your client. And again, the reason why we want to do that is we want to figure out how many people are exposed to our client, again, because we can assume in some way or capacity a level of awareness. Once more, media impressions. So impressions are basically, they measure exposure, right? So whether or not or how many people saw the ad, or again, I want to make sure I'm using my language here carefully, how many folks were exposed to that ad. So I want to go onto a random website here. Maybe I'll go onto the Columbus Dispatch so I can show you guys an example. Can you guys still see my screen here? sure. Hope so. All right, so we're going on to the Columbus Dispatch website. And let me see if there are any ads here. So yes, there actually are. But I might not have actually seen that ad. I might not have engaged with that ad. And the ad that I'm referring to here is actually the one that you see up here at the top. That's an ad. But if we're looking at impressions or if we're using impressions, it's going to count that as one impression. It's going to count that as an exposure. So exposure sometimes doesn't necessarily translate into whether or not I saw this ad that you see here at the Columbus Dispatch or on the Columbus Dispatch website. I bet you if I hadn't even pointed it out that it was an ad, many of you guys would have just continued to scroll down or look at other elements of this website. So again, those are some of the limitations in using, impressions to basically assume that someone saw your communication message. All right, and again, let me know if you can't see my slides, because for some reason on my end, it's looking a little weird. The quality of the message, again, we can conduct a survey or a focus group would probably be better to figure out whether or not people actually understand our message, but again, a survey would be fine as well. All right, so again, just kind of really honing in on this point in terms of making sure that you guys understand that impressions do not necessarily measure engagement. So I'm using one of my tweets as an example, one of my pinned tweets on my Twitter account. So last year I delivered a TED Talk and I talked about it a little bit on Twitter. So as you guys can see here, if you look at, if you look at the data that everyone actually, if you're a Twitter user, you can easily access. So in terms of impressions for this tweet, at least at this time, because I believe I screenshot this like last semester, almost 10,000 people were exposed to this message, whether that was, people retweeting it and then it was in their, timeline or in their feed, I should say. But as you guys can see here with engagement, only 504 people really interacted with that tweet. And in terms of how they're measuring engagement, that being Twitter, how many people actually clicked on that tweet, on the link that I provided to my TED Talk. How many folks liked it? How many people actually, expanded my message and folks, clicked on my profile and liked it and things of that sort. So once more, I'm using this example to illustrate that impressions are just exposure. Whether or not people, are able to be exposed to that message, if it's in their feed, if it's in their, TV segment, for instance, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're paying attention to it or engaging with that communication message. So definitely know that for the exam. Any questions over the difference between impressions, what impressions are, versus engagement, like engaging with an actual message, how we're defining that? Okay. Y'all are kind of quiet today. It's okay. All right, and then next, looking at how do we evaluate acceptance objective statements. Once more, again, that's what we're evaluating in our campaign. So when it comes to objective statements that seek to basically target, your audience's attitudes, we want to figure out, how do people feel about our campaign message? I see there's something in the chat. I'll get to that in just a second. And more importantly, what kind of effect did that message have on our audience's attitudes towards the brand? Did that have no impact whatsoever? Did it strengthen their attitudes towards the brand? Did it change it completely? So these are things that we need to look at. And one of the methods that we would typically use, of course, is a survey, for instance, to see if, compared to that market research that we conducted before the implementation of the campaign, whether or not that data has changed after the campaign has been implemented and has, finished. We also might want to look at online reviews. Now, I want to put a little asterisk by that, and I should have, to be honest with you, because just because there is a change in Yelp reviews, around the time that you are implementing this campaign, you can't assume causality. And for those who are in research methods, I'm sure you guys have talked a great deal about correlation versus causation. So we can say that there is some, correlation or association between our campaign efforts and, a change in Yelp reviews or Google reviews or even social media, talk about the client. But we can't say that because of our campaign efforts, it affected those, online reviews, unless we did some type of experiment where we can control those external variables and those factors. So just keep that in mind as well when you guys, especially for those who actually want to go into this industry, that you want to make sure that you're using and being intentional about the language that you're using, I should say, when you're saying that, our campaign affected online reviews. So let me go ahead and pause here. I see there's something in the chat. So Sarah asked, so media impressions is exposure to an advertisement or media? Absolutely. Yes, you got it, Sarah. So yes, impressions are just whether or not you were exposed to it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you saw that ad. It doesn't necessarily mean that you engaged with it, that you clicked on it. Those are two completely different things. And then Kerrigan asks, can I go back to the previous slide? Absolutely. So yes, with our acceptance objective statements, what we're specifically evaluating is the audience's attitudes towards our message, whether or not, it had an impact on their attitude in some capacity, whether no impact, some impact, or a great deal of impact. All right, and then the last thing that we're evaluating, or the last objective statement that we're evaluating, are action objective statements. So this is actually pretty easy to evaluate, I think so, compared to like maybe someone's attitudes, right? So how do you measure an attitude? That can be really complex. But anyways, action objective statements in terms of how we evaluate it, we look at people's behavioral response to the message. So whether or not, a social media post that we put out about a grand opening or a new event that Global Gifts is putting out, or putting on, I should say, whether or not there's been an increase in attendance at that event, whether or not there's been an increase in donations to Global Gifts. So we would look at those things as well. We would also look at purchasing behaviors, right? So whether or not there's an increase in sales, things of that sort. So I think, with action objective statements, when we're trying to figure out whether or not we accomplish them, they, for the most part, at least in my opinion, tend to be a little bit easier to, from just a black and white, clear standpoint, to measure and to prove to the client, like, yes, we had an increase in sales, or more people attended this event that you guys usually hold, as a result of our campaign. So I think for the most part, that should be pretty straightforward for you guys to remember for the exam. And also when you guys go to finish your campaign proposal, especially if you have those objective statements. All right, so just to kind of recap a little bit, because I feel like I gave you guys a ton of information. I went through what exactly do we evaluate in this part of the campaign process. We evaluate our objective statements, right? When do we do that? We do that throughout the campaign process, or throughout after the implementation of the campaign. So the beginning, middle, and the end. And how do we do that? That really depends upon what kind of objective statement you're evaluating. If you're evaluating awareness, you might want to look at impressions, or just, using a clipping service to see, how many newspaper articles are talking about our client, for instance. You could conduct a post-campaign content analysis yourself if you wanted to for media coverage. I've seen some PR agencies do that. For acceptance objective statements, we want to look at like survey and focus group data after the campaign is finished. And once more, for action objective statements, there's a ton of things that we can do here, looking at whether or not there's an increase in our sales, donations, volunteer registration, whether more people are coming to our events, things of that sort. All right, and so the last thing I want to talk about is how do we evaluate tactics that are coming from that PESO model that we discussed last class. So if you're looking at paid media, like your traditional advertisements that you're going to see on TV, for those who are taking media planning with Mary, I'm sure you guys have talked about HUT versus PUT. HUT means basically homes using TV within a specific area. PUT is a little bit different. It's people using TV. So Nielsen does this a lot in terms of looking at ratings and how many households are looking at a specific program or using, TV, I should say, versus how many people within that household are using the TV. Also, we might want to look at to what degree are we reaching people through this ad, and that's not necessarily just TV ads, but just the reach in general with any type of ad. Whether or not people are clicking on our ad on, for example, Facebook, our paid social media posts, does that redirect them to our website? Are they actually engaging in our website of that, in that fashion? Now, earned media is a little bit different in terms of how we evaluate the successfulness of those type of tactics coming out of earned media. Again, we want to make sure that we are using that clipping service that I talked about, which once more is just a media monitoring service, to see to what degree are news organizations talking about our client. We also might want to conduct our own post-campaign content analysis. Whether or not there is a change in some type of social media talk, in general, in reference to the article that's about our client. And again, we can use impressions as well here with earned media. So how many people clicked on that article, for example, that news article about our client, how many people shared that out. And speaking of shared, with shared media, once more, we're going to look a lot at social media analytics. So we're going to look at how many people are liking, a post that we, co-created with a user. How many comments did we receive, for instance? We want to make sure that we're using social media monitoring services to our advantage. I know right now, given the time that we're going through, companies are definitely using social media monitoring services just to make sure that their communication response is resonating with people, that they're not receiving any type of backlash, especially since, a lot of people, for good reason are on edge here. So we're seeing, again, many companies using social media monitoring services just to make sure that their social media response is fine. And then with owned media, we're going to be using primarily like website trafficking data or tracking data, like Google Analytics, for instance. If we're creating our own newsletter, we might want to use MailChimp data. And I want to go ahead and show you guys what that looks like on the back end here. So I might have told you guys this. I'm a writer for a co-working space in Columbus here called Zora's House, and I write the newsletter for them using MailChimp. And so just to kind of look at the data on one of our email marketing campaigns, you can see here, like you can compare your, email marketing campaign performance to, comparable industries or comparable companies. You can even compare a specific email marketing campaign to some of your previous or other previous campaign efforts. Here you can see how many people have opened this, newsletter versus how many people are clicking on, some of the links that I've provided, and how many people unsubscribed. We can also get some demographic data as well. And then there's a few other things. I don't think it's here. Oh, yes. Yep. So clicks per unique open. So, that's the percentage of clicks that we're receiving here per subscriber. And then in general, how many opens as a result of this campaign. So again, those are some of the things that we can use with owned media in terms of some of the data that we can use to figure out whether or not we're actually on track with our campaign objective statements and the overall goal. For the exam, I recommend also that you guys look at this chart that I provided to you guys. It's actually straight from your textbook, but again, I'm sure some of you guys might not have or no longer have access to the textbook. And so this chart basically helps to explain the different ways that we can measure the successfulness of tactics in that PESO model. But again, what it does a great job of is looking at whether or not we want to measure the successfulness of exposure versus engagement versus, ROI, so return on investment, influence, and action. So I'm not saying you have to memorize all of this that you see here on this chart, but I think if we want to connect this back to the PESO model that we talked about last class, it definitely helps to illustrate the different ways that you can measure the successfulness of media tactics. And I think more importantly, this is going to be very useful for you all when you go to talk about how you're going to evaluate your PESO tactics. So definitely keep this in mind, keep this handy, not only for the exam, but more importantly for your paper. We have something in the chat here. So Tamani asked, can I please go back to the earned media slide when you're done? Yes, earned media. Tamani, do you mean this slide? I hope it is. Okay, great. Yeah, if at any point in time I'm going too fast, just let me know. Yep, so once more with earned media, that is again news coverage. Earned media is when we're trying to convince people or convince journalists to talk about our client, to earn that media coverage. So we're looking at how many people are clicking on articles about our client, how many people are exposed to that article, whether or not it's gaining traction in terms of people are commenting on it, what's the valence or what's the exact opinion about, you know, the article, and more importantly about our client. So those are things that we would look at. If we wanted to really study the comments, you know, as it relates to our earned media efforts, we would do what's called a textual analysis. I haven't talked about that in class. You don't need to know that for the exam, but for those who are really interested in this type of stuff, we wouldn't conduct like a survey or anything like that. We will look at, you know, the trends, like the type of comments that we're getting, and categorize that into, for example, favorable, neutral, or unfavorable comments, things of that nature. All right, so very last thing, I promise, before we get on to the exam review, I wanna make sure this is making sense to you guys. So the first objective statement here that I have provided to you guys, read it to yourself and tell me, how would you measure the successfulness of this objective statement? So in other words, how would you evaluate whether or not you actually accomplished the first objective statement? Just look at the first one, then we'll get to the second one. And you can put your response in the chat. So what type of measurements, what type of research or tools would you use? And you can look back in your notes. So if we wanted to figure out whether or not current donors understand the brand identity of Global Gifts, what type of tools or measurements will we use to figure that out? What could we do at the end of our campaign? Okay, so Sarah said use a clipping service. So Sarah, we would only use a clipping service if we're trying to track like media coverage, things of that nature, like the reach or frequency of media coverage. So if we wanted to make sure that there is an increase in media coverage in general, right? So if we wanted to have an impact on the action of Columbus Dispatch reporters, for instance, and we specifically want to increase the amount of articles that they're posting or, you know, writing about our client, with that objective statement that I just kind of rushed through and gave to you, we would use a clipping service, again, because our target public is media. Here, our target public in this campaign objective statement is current donors. So we wouldn't use a clipping service to figure out whether or not current donors understand the brand identity of Global Gifts. So Kate, oh, I'm sorry, Erin. So how would we measure whether or not current donors of Global Gifts truly understand the brand identity? And so Curtis wrote survey or focus group. Absolutely, yes. So we can conduct a post-campaign survey and look at whether or not there are any differences, you know, compared to the pre-campaign, you know, survey, the market research essentially, whether or not there are any differences between the two. Very good. So Kendall wrote post-campaign survey as well. Yep. And then Curtis also said focus group. We could do a focus group. And actually, depending upon the nature of the campaign, I guess you can say, it might be more appropriate to conduct a focus group. All right, seems like you guys got that one. Let's try the second one. To have an effect on the action of corporate sponsors, specifically to maintain a consistent annual donation. So how could we how can we measure whether or not we actually did get a consistent annual donation from our corporate sponsors? How would we measure that? How could we prove that to the client, whether or not we accomplished that? Yes, very good. So Curtis put track the money. I like that, track the money. Yes. Aaron put compare last year's donations to this year's, very good. Donation attendance figures, very good, Kendall. Yes, excellent. All right, and then the last two that I have here. So looking at this third objective statement, to have an effect on the acceptance of Columbus residents age 20 to 30, specifically to increase positive attitudes towards global gifts fundraising events. So how could we basically measure whether or not there's a change in attitudes towards global gifts fundraising events? How can we measure that? How do we try to measure attitudes from a communication standpoint, and just in general, from a research standpoint? How do we measure attitudes? So in this situation, I'll go ahead and give it to you guys. In this situation, we could, yeah, so Kerrigan put conducting interviews. Yeah, you definitely could. So you can conduct interviews over, you know, the same people that you might have like interviewed pre-campaign in your market research to see if there's any change in their attitudes pre-campaign versus post-campaign. Aaron put survey interview. Yes, very good. Tracking how many people are coming to the events, we actually would do that with an action objective statement, because remember, acceptance objective statements basically target people's attitudes. Now, if I said something like to have an effect on the action of Columbus residents ages 20 to 30, specifically to increase their attendance at Global Gifts fundraising events, then yes, absolutely, Aaron, you would be right in terms of tracking how many people are coming to those events. But if we just want to look at whether or not people feel good or feel positively about those events, we would just conduct a survey or a focus group or an interview like Kerrigan had suggested. And the last one, to have an impact on the action of employees at Global Gifts, specifically to increase engagement with the company newsletter. So how can we measure that? If you guys remember the example that I showed you guys in light of MailChimp. So how could we measure whether or not people are engaging, employees are engaging with our company newsletter? What could we look at? So for that one, we, might want to look at MailChimp data, reports from that specific, newsletter platform, analytics like Abra just kind of alluded to here. Excellent. All right. So for the exam, I might have, example objective statements like you see here, and then it's up to you to determine which method is probably most appropriate to measure whether or not you accomplish that objective statement. So keep that in mind for the exam. All right, so that's all I have for you guys in terms of lecture. I want to go ahead and open it up to any questions that you all might have about the exam. If you can, since this is a live lecture, go ahead and ask your questions here in the chat. And then later on, in the day or throughout the weekend, if you guys have specific questions or lingering questions, go ahead and go to the discussions post on Canvas. While you guys are thinking about some questions, if you do have any, the exam is, the format is very similar, if not the exact same as the first exam. So there will be 30 questions. Each question is worth 2 points. Since we are in a very different environment, it is open book. However, it's timed, so you have only an hour to complete the exam. But, based upon how you guys did the last exam, it didn't seem like many of you needed a full hour, but once more, we're in a completely different environment, so I want to make sure I'm giving you guys enough time there. Multiple choice, true, false. There are no open answers. I know originally when I thought we were only going to be doing this for 2 weeks, I thought about incorporating more, fill in the blank, open-ended answers or questions. Can't talk today. but I'm not going to do that anymore. So it's going to be pretty straightforward in terms of the format, true, false, and multiple choice. There is no access code. Again, as soon as midnight comes around next Monday, you can take the exam. So if you want to take an exam at midnight, that's great. You have the entire day to take the exam. So you have until 11:59 p.m. that same day, next Monday, to complete it. There are no extensions on the exam, unfortunately, unless you're going through something very, very serious. I mean, we all are. But if you are getting, sick, or if there's a relevant or relative who's really sick, or just life is happening to you, please make sure you email me beforehand so I can try my best to make those accommodations for you. So yep, that's the format of the exam. Any questions at all? And the exam study guide should be posted already for you. Let me go ahead and go through at least what you'll need to know. I'm not going to go through it like in a lot of detail, but I will at least remind you guys what's going to be covered on the exam. And once more, let me know if you cannot see my screen. Come on, Word. All right, so in terms of what you will need to know for the exam, market research, so that was the first topic that we talked about after the first exam. So you'll need to understand, like, the purpose of market research. And market research is the same thing as primary research. I use those terms, interchangeably. What's a focus group, things of that sort. What is a survey? How do we create good survey questions? What's a content analysis? How do you interpret data? I went through that, that one class period. General campaign strategies, that's specifically coming from your notes. The market research chapter, you can use your notes, and if you still have the textbook, you can also use your textbook as a guide as well. Know all the strategies that I talked about in that lecture. That again was campaign strategies. So I talked about proactive versus reactive strategies. Know all of them. And then creating the message strategy, you'll need to know that for the exam, even though that's something that you don't need to write about, in section 2. Oh my gosh, I just forgot. I forgot to post those slides for that because I know we'd only finished about 3/4 of that lecture. So I'll post those slides so that you have access to that. And then the PESO model, we talked about that last class. So know what exactly is the PESO model, the various different categories within that: paid, earned, shared, and owned media. Can you be able, or will you be able to identify an example of paid media versus owned media? And whether or not there could potentially be intersections between, paid versus shared, things of that nature. So I think the example that I gave last class is a press release can be considered both owned and earned media. So it's owned because the publicist or whoever is writing that press release works for the client or, works for that organization. But it's also earned because we sometimes send press releases to reporters in hopes that they'll, talk more about that topic in our press release. And then evaluative research, that was also something, obviously something that we covered today in class. So know what exactly is evaluative research, why do we do it, what are we evaluating, when do we do this, and what methods do we use. And then my last point here is make sure that you guys understand the difference between strategies and tactics. I think, to be honest with you, actual communication professionals who are doing this every single day, there's some challenges in terms of understanding the difference between strategies and tactics. So strategies, if I could use a football analogy, strategies are basically like your football game plan, right? So, how you're going to execute X, Y, and Z. And then the tactics are how well you actually execute your strategy on the field. How well do you play on the field? So the tactics are what I can actually see. What does the audience see? So for example, let's say that your strategy is to enhance audience engagement because there's a lack of audience engagement there. So that's the strategy. What is the tactic? What does that look like? Does that look like putting on a special event? Does that look like, I don't know, creating some type of social media contest so that you can enhance social media audience engagement? So that's what I mean in terms of some of the differences between strategies and tactics. Strategies are a bit broader than tactics. Tactics you can actually see and touch and, you know, interact with. Strategies are the idea, behind the tactics. If you're still confused about strategies versus tactics, I believe in, it's either this week's module or next week, I have, let's see, I'll actually put it up here as well. I have a document here. I believe this is off of or out of someone's paper from a couple of semesters ago, section 2. And this group did a really good job of explaining, not, you know, directly explaining the difference between strategies and tactics, but they do a really good job of writing, you know, their strategy versus the tactic. So definitely take a look at that just in case my explanation just now was still, you know, a little unclear, or you're still struggling with knowing the difference between strategies and tactics. All right, I'm looking here at the chat. I don't see any questions. I'll go ahead and pause maybe for a minute to see if you guys have any questions. I know it's probably hard to think of, you know, at this time. You guys are still transitioning to this new normal, this new life that we have. So it's okay if you don't have any questions. I just wanted to, you know, leave that opportunity for you guys to ask questions during the live lecture. I don't know where my dog went. All right. Well, if you guys don't, oh, hold on one second. Thought I saw something. Okay. If you guys do not have any further questions, I'll go ahead and stop it here. Thank you guys so much for once again attending lecture. As a reminder, since we have the exam next Monday, there will not be any lecture whatsoever. So just make sure you put a reminder in your phone and take the exam at some point in time next Monday. And then Wednesday, I have more information coming about that. Amy is willing to meet with us over the phone, of course, to talk more about your projects. We're still kind of talking about how we can do this in the least stressful manner possible. It's probably going to be a situation where, I think I talked about this in light of one of my video announcements, only about 2 to 3 folks from your group will serve as representatives during the client meeting. And talk about what you guys have kind of worked on. She's going to be more than, you know, understanding if you haven't really worked on too much. But if you have any questions for her, that will be a great opportunity to ask those questions. So, but again, more information coming about that later on. Let's just take this one day at a time. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me, and I will hopefully hear from you guys next week.